So welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to invite you and the audience to take part in the roundtable, or rather, we should say, a dialogue and conversation between us that hopefully will generate different interesting thoughts. And I would like to locate just the project, an Atlas of Global and Local Imaginaries. And it's a project within the Korean Pavilion, the Future School, the program for the Future School in the Korean Pavilion of the Venice Biennale, which was scheduled to happen 2020, but due to the pandemic happens this year, 2021. We are very pleased, and we also consider the program for the Future School extremely important and significant, advancing a possibility of many people taking part, sharing ideas, becoming a network, and also a platform for exchange of what future challenges architecture, but also architecture education faces. The project itself, an Atlas of Global and Local Imaginaries, take that standing point, utilizing Future School as a platform to exchange ideas and experiences. This is one of the dialogue roundtables as a series of discussions that we aim to have as an online archive, and looking at projects from a range of different perspectives. Today we will be discussing themes such as representation, social engagement, climate change, critical pedagogies, and very much departing from each of the participants in the team of the project own presentations and experiences. And then after the short presentations, we will continue discussing these different angles, perspectives, and topics. On practicalities, I should just announce that please, if it's okay to be recorded, the Zoom monitor is recording the session. So please let us know, otherwise we carry on. And if otherwise, you should just be aware that we are recording the session. And the second thing is that is important is if you pose questions, do that in the chat. There will not be a chance to perhaps have long conversations with everybody. So it's important that we get a range of questions and try to see if some questions have commonalities that we can address them. And hopefully we'll also have the time to have an open conversation with the audience. So with no further ado, I should also tell that my name is Anna Betancour. I am a professor of architecture. I'm based in Umeå School of Architecture in Umeå University, but I am part of this project as an independent project together with a community of architects, artists, photographers, curators, and I'm looking forward. So anyway, with no further ado, I would like to give the word to David Ortega. Go ahead, and each participant will shortly introduce themselves as well. So thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Anna. I'm very pleased to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm David Ortega. I am originally from Mexico City, and now I'm based in Madrid doing a PhD. But I also teach both in Mexico, and I've been also teaching in Sweden for several years. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Should we do a round of introductions and then you start, David? That's maybe nice. So I just give the name as I see you. Cheu, would you like to introduce yourself? You're muted.
Great. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Lovely. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is An Jae-woo, and it's a Korean name. An is my family name. Jae-woo is my given name. So I'm pretty much trying to say that for our international audience that my first name is my last name and my last name is my first name. So yes, please feel free to call me Jae-woo if you have any questions. I am a curator and a culture critic, and my culture criticism is heavily focused on urbanism, as a matter of fact. And because of that, I had the absolute pleasure of working with NSCJ and the other wonderful faculty members of UMA, the Umeå School of Architecture at Umeå University. That was 2 years ago. Currently, I am based here in Seoul, South Korea, and in Berlin, Germany. And it's an absolute pleasure to take part in this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Joe. Killian, would you like to go?
Hello, my name is Killian Doherty. I'm an architect, but currently a lecturer in architecture and urbanism at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. And I will let my presentation speak to my interests or lack of interests.
Great, thank you so much, Killian. Mateusz.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. My name is Mateusz Pozar. I'm originally from Poland, but brought up in Sweden. I currently live in Gothenburg, south of Sweden. I'm here because I'm a transmedia artist, I guess, mostly photography and imagery, but computers, biology, that kind of stuff. So I've also been guest teaching in architectural sphere, but right now it's today I'm going to focus on my own practice more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mateusz. CJ, would you like to say a few words about you yourself?
Yes. My name is Carl-Johan Vesterlund, or CJ in this international context. I'm an architect. I am co-organizing this event together with Anna Betancour, and I'm also teaching at the Umeå School of Architecture as a senior lecturer. And I say, like Killian, we will see more about my interests and common interest with Anna in our presentation.
Great, thank you very much. And we go ahead and start. The structure, as you have seen, is that we first do each a short presentation, and then we open the floor for discussion and questions. Unfortunately, two of the panelists, due to circumstances of illness and so forth, couldn't join us, but we are happy that we are such a large team, so we will have plenty to say. So please, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have to fix this. Sorry about minor adjustments. This project that I'm going to show is what I've been developing together with the University of Tec de Monterrey. It's a private university in Mexico that has many campuses across the country, with several campuses in the main cities of Mexico. Particularly, this one is located in Toluca. It's a city west of Mexico City. And what's been really interesting is that at first they called us just to do a project about how the campus can be integrated to the future project of a train that will be connecting both Mexico City and Toluca, which works almost like a satellite city, although it has a very background in itself. It is very interesting to mention that trains have been, in the last 100 years, have disappeared in the country, as in many places in the whole Latin America. And nowadays there are many initiatives to bring back trains for passengers, so that to connect better the places around. In 2017, we started the project as an outsider, so to say, as an independent project. But later on in 2018, I was called and I was asked to be part of the academic project, both to connect the initiative of the integration of that master plan together with the academia. And in further years, there will be several experiments according to that, which is very interesting because it's a way of understanding how the project can actually be in the future. So the objectives of the project are both integration of the campus in the urban context, which has to do also with the Vision 2030 from UN and so on. And also connecting with other stakeholders, developers, government, academia, social organizations, and so on. One of the main focuses also was the creation of an urban lab so that we can trigger and develop projects, local projects within the community and also with the university, of course. And of course, sort of an intention of developing the agenda for the region, linking all these projects that are happening nowadays in Mexico. The plan focuses on two main questions. What brings me here? Understanding that cities are the ways of developing opportunities for people. So they're like poles of attraction to people. But also, how do I get here in terms of like transportation or other means of mobility, which is also the trigger for this project. We at the beginning developed this initiative through the understanding on several scales on how the city of Toluca works together with the metropolitan area of Mexico City and other cities around in the region, and how this train will link not only the cities, but also the main transport networks that are in both cities happening. At the end, we developed this sort of strategy on how we can actually take a little piece of the whole master planning on the huge scale and starting like narrowing it down so that we can understand how to approach to the project on the local scale. Asking ourselves again the same question, because when I came out from the station, I get down from the train, then how do I get to the actual campus or the surroundings of the area? And that's where we found many interesting issues that can be worked on this more particular scale. And from there, we understood that the main park that is around an existing park and the station will be both sort of the main triggers for the development of the area. So the master plan was developed through all these ideas or principles, creating this image of what we would like to have in the future, how the park becomes the core of the project. Then we can develop some other corridors for development and so on. Creating a pipeline, a project pipeline that has to do with all these sort of concepts, because this will allow government, for example, to also embrace the project making for themselves, and so that work together with it. After that, we developed a lot of projects in the past 2 years to, as I said, put on a trial, no? the ideas and the pilots that we can develop from there, making projects from like how to work with the border of the park, or even developing mixed-use buildings and so on. No? We have invited very interesting stakeholders for that. Mario Molina's Center, for example, the Nobel Prize from Mexico, who discovered the ozone hole, that has developed in the last years very interesting research on how the urban development is linked to emissions. A local NGO and other stakeholders, even the Zurich ETH was part of this sort of discussions also. This is the exercise that were developed by students. And after all these years, we have developed a really interesting conscience on the students, for example, organizing local cycle tours to understand mobility issues, accessibility issues, and how they can actually enhance their own projects. Participatory plan and workshop with neighbors, organized by students themselves, with a big model so that we can be aware of like what's the reality of the site and how can we develop better. Organizing exhibitions in the local museums with all these projects, and at the end developing sort of like more into detail the master planning of that. How can this look into the future? The lab, which is sort of like the possible next step to take, is how we can actually link this into applied research, how we can extend and link other stakeholders. Maybe also link it with future education that is linked with the UN Habitat agenda, and of course, making it into publication. So far, we have developed 5 booklets that are online available so that people can see the results from all these academic projects and how we can be linking everything together. This is a very open-ended project, and it's ongoing, and we're hopefully trying to see something actually built or something actually visible, which will be like the main focus for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very interesting. And I should say that this is very much linked to your own practice. So we will have plenty of opportunities to continue discussing. Let me just introduce the next presentation, which Killian, is that right? Killian Doherty, the floor is yours. You're muted, Killian.
Hello, do you hear me? Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. This is a sort of a kind of moment for me to try and gather some of my own thoughts about my work. And so I framed it around this idea of this West African ritual, Tambundu, and I'll speak about that in a minute. But a lot of my work really comes back to my being a sort of a subject of the post-colonial and post-conflict state. I'm from Northern Ireland, and so I'm interested in, let's say, the kind of contradictory role architecture plays as a sort of an agent of destruction and construction. And so I'm interested in sort of architecture's, on one hand, it's this apparatus of this colonial capitalist developmentalist state, yet as a means to redesign towards this idea of a shared futures. Now this notion shared futures is particularly important in Northern Ireland because it's the term under which the sort of Good Friday Agreement is kind of ruled out and which is currently being tested by Brexit. So the images here are the historical images of land evictions in Ireland, of the land-based agrarian poor as a result of the kind of British occupation, and most of the land was confiscated from the Irish Catholic landowners during the plantations and granted to Scottish and English settlers. And it's ironic that I end up in Scotland. But if you look closely at this image, you'll see the way, obviously, kind of vegetation is used to it's incorporated into the windows as a way to thwart this act of ruination. And so here is like an example of someone evicted or a family evicted from those homes, and they re-inhabit the landscape temporarily, but literally. I mean, this house is made of turf. And so sort of these parallels have kind of taken much of my work has been in the development of West and East Africa over the past 10 years. And so the word development, the sort of etymology of it means sort of the unfolding of this vision to improve. And so I'm sort of interested in the way these visions build over the kind of dynamic sort of existing socio-ecological dependencies and the relations between people and place. And so the image on the left is, this is sort of a historical overview. The image on the left is for the Conference of Tropical Architecture in 1953. So from the report of the proceedings, which was this conference held in UCL in March 1953. And you can see about moving with the times and the sort of primacy of these Western building technologies and architectural forms. And then on the right-hand side is what's happening today with a number of, or thousands of indigenous communities across Rwanda, Congo, and the Uganda, whom I work with, the sort of transition from the eviction from the forests and the eradication of these temporary dwellings and the kind of forceful resettlement into these modern homes. So in one way, what I'm saying is like, this is not a kind of historical thing in the past, colonialism. It's trans-historical, but it's also kind of trans-global. It transcends space. I mean, here on the image you'll see on your screen is an image taken from another site that I work in Liberia about the kind of extraction of ore from Liberia, which ends up building kind of cities in the Western world. Here, New York in the 1960s. And so my work kind of like tries to kind of juggle with these scales between the sort of specificity of place, but also try to grasp the kind of global. And it's sort of ways to kind of articulate our blindness and shape new ways to kind of think about kind of the climate and the environment. But I also use architecture as a way to kind of communicate. So it's a sort of intracultural tool to kind of communicate and understand about these rituals of specificity and place, okay? And so this idea of Tambondu is this ecological ritual in West Africa, kind of structures some of the body of work and teachings that I'm currently engaging in. And so Tambondu, I've sort of given an outline of what it is. It's the sort of practice of replenishing land where a settlement once was through, let's say, vegetation. I mean, the soil is enriched with fire ash. It's enriched with animal and human beings having been there. And it's a sort of shared space, and it's kind of turned over time. And so these are sort of mounded accretions which kind of grow outwards. So there's this, it becomes a sort of idea of kind of rethinking the kind of ruin. But what it does is it sort of conflicts with understandings of the built and natural environment, the sort of linearity of it, and how they're economically structured. So these are really ways to think about egalitarian kind of ways of space and ecological ways of space. And they sort of, I'm trying to use this within a number of sites across Liberia, Rwanda, and Scotland. So I hope to get through this in the next minute or two. So the first kind of site that one of the sites that I've been working with is within a kind of ruin of a town that is a mine in northern Liberia. And it's really, this was kind of the largest site for iron ore between the kind of 1960s and 1980s. Vast quantities of ore, all consumed, mostly consumed by the Western world. And at once this was the fastest growing town in Liberia as a result of that. It was referred to as the New York of Liberia, and it was the result of European demand. The ore in this town was eventually depleted, and the town and landscape fell into ruins, and it was implicated in the kind of Liberian Civil War. So very few people know about this, but this mine is active today, and it's owned by the largest manufacturers of structural steel. But there's these whole concealed histories about the taking of indigenous ancestral lands. But as I say, this ruin is still active, and this ore is sort of still being kind of fed into the kind of colonial supply chains. But this ruin is actually now today expanding even further into Guinea, and it's been funded by the World Bank. And so it's expanding into this strict nature reserve in Guinea. And so one of the projects has been to kind of make a film about this, to kind of understand this ruin as an intercultural construction, okay? So it's in Liberia, but it was made by the Swedish, made by the Americans and the Liberians. And so the project is really about the kind of the telling of this place. The film is called Upland. Some of you may have seen it. But as this mine is expanding now further into Guinea and reactivating the area, there's been a need to kind of retranslate the film and bring it back and use it as a tool for intercultural communication. So it's been translated back into the Liberian native dialect of Mano, and it's being taken back to Liberia next year. And next year marks Liberia's bicentennial of Black American settlement under white direction. So this is Otello here translating it, and this is him recording it in the studio in America. And so the idea really is to use this as a tool to kind of talk about learning about the environment and learning about the history of it. Because the education that has been, let's say, pushed upon the people in Liberia is about how to mine and how to be developed is to work in the mine. So really it's about trying to shape the curriculum of this vocational school within the town and to allow indigenous conceptions of nature to kind of partake in the knowledge of Ukapa, and those who would sort of graduate would become custodians of Ukapa So it's sort of like a school around, a school that is against the paradigm of mining, so to speak. And so the second kind of mine or conceptual mine that I work with is the kind of genocide or ruin of Rwanda. And it's undergoing this kind of post-war image of ethnic reconciliation. This is the kind of main image of the city master plan, but it's one of like extreme violent neoliberalism in that it's like completely tries to eradicate the poor from the existing kind of face of Rwanda. And when I say the poor, I also mean the kind of land-dependent poor, the 70% of the population. So it's a kind of violent vision to kind of wipe the poor from the map. But it's also implicated within this kind of ethnic history of wiping particular ethnicities from the map. And these ethnicities that I'm concerned with are indigenous ethnicities who've historically been erased from the map, but by the map. And so the kind of research is really, really sort of like a long kind of research project working with these indigenous communities, forest communities who've been forcefully resettled. And it really uses architectural methods of participation, yes, but really substantive participation kind of through drawing, walking and mapping. And mapping is particularly important because it's sort of the colonial tool and the tool that erased the Batwa. So these are the sorts of maps that we do. They're landscape maps that are made and models. We use models. And the research on one hand puts the Batwa back onto the map literally, okay? So these are the sort of dominant images of the forests as vacant, but they actually see them in another way. And so the research is kind of uses knowledge to communicate how indigenous communities sort of inhabit economic understandings of the environment. And these are the sort of like elaborate sort of maps that we're making. These are like kind of dynamic maps which the Batwa have mapped to kind of show that the forest is not a vacant space, but a kind of a polyvalent dwelling, you know, and it's like where dwelling is not conditional to built form. And so the idea is this is a long-term research project to include indigenous communities as kind of stakeholders within the conservation and management of these areas within Rwanda, which are the most economic spaces. They're not urban, but they are the most economic in terms of generating revenue from tourism. So I'll just fly on. So these are the sorts of kind of projects that are coming out of that. And so now I'll kind of come quickly to kind of Scotland. Some of the work that I've been doing in Africa, now I've kind of tried to bring into the kind of studio here. And a lot of the studio was really trying to understand Edinburgh's kind of new town or Edinburgh's built form through its kind of colonial past. What you're looking at here is the James Craig's plan of the new town of Edinburgh, this sort of rational ordered plan, but it was one really built on power and privilege and on empire. And so the kind of students begun to kind of engage with historical understandings of Scotland kind of through, let's say, these neoclassical Scottish architects who were connected to and funded a lot of the trafficking of slaves and extraction of natural resources from abroad. And so the kind of students then began to situate this within the kind of the Scotland landscape, which has these ruins of the industrial past, these shield bings. But these are now like, were once barren spoil heaps, but are now provide a refuge for rare wildlife. So the students kind of through walking through the city and engaging with historians who are historians on the African diaspora and Scotland's kind of colonial past, begun to kind of redraw a lot of these architectural kind of monuments, and they were redrawn in a way that they were implicated on a kind of global scale, Scotland's kind of implication within the kind of global, let's say, colonial project. So it's to map the footprint of colonial knowledge and power. And here what you have is an image of towns across the world and countries across the world that have taken on the name of this man, Dundas, this prominent Scottish merchant to whom this monument in the centre of Edinburgh is commissioned to. And then they really kind of got into the sort of environmental kind of footprint and the kind of the form of these mines, the language of the mine, and they begun to use it as a way to kind of subvert, as a kind of design tool to kind of subvert the kind of existing new town plan. And so here's kind of a project from Jenny, Jacob and Caitlin. It's called Decommissioning Dundas, and it employs this mining language to kind of cut into the existing new town to create new public spaces for civic dialogue, but for nature to kind of re-inhabit the new town. So it's a kind of a non-extractive vision and sort of sites within which these colonial histories are decommissioned. So, so it's these sort of types of projects, and really it's like to begin to kind of engage with the kind of idea of, let's say, these neoclassical monuments as these monuments that inspire this socially unacceptable behavior. This monument that the students, let's say, decommissioned or ruined was the site for the Black Lives Matter protest in Scotland. And so kind of really this idea of the Tambondu, this idea of the kind of the shared ruin and the kind of idea of the restorative power of the ruin is really as a kind of a fecund space to kind of understand, let's say, destruction, yeah, but fecund for understanding the physical space, sort of a materiality as dynamic, shared and polyvalent, I mean egalitarian. And so really it's, I'm kind of like trying to work through this idea of the Tambondu is to rethink the idea of ruins and how they might be reimagined within these sort of contemporary crises. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. You managed to cover quite a wide range. Looking forward to discuss further. So let me give the word to the next speaker. It's a presentation, Cheu and
Sure.
Cheu.
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right. Okay, so I first want to say a huge kudos to both Killian and David for their extremely significant, interesting, and inspirational projects. I hope I can meet that level as well, but let's see. This one is called Art Phobia, Subjectification and Architecture. I blended a number of a few different projects for the spirit and the mission of our team, an Atlas of Global and Local Imaginaries, under the idea of Future School, the Korean Pavilion for this year's Venice Biennale. But so what exactly is this? Art phobia, subjectification, and architecture. Let's have a brief look. First off, art phobia. So being here in Korea, and I think because I actually talked about this on national radio during a live broadcast, and so many people gave me a positive feedback that they so much agree. But pretty much the question that I have is, from first grade of elementary school all the way up to senior year in high school, so that's 12 years here in Korea, formal education, we go through so many different styles and textbooks of education regarding art and music. And pretty much the thing is, if you think about that, we understand that there's some kind of a pedagogical goal to inform the youngsters of this country on what exactly art is, what is good art, what is not good art, and why art is important for your life, yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, because of how education functions, especially a prestigious college education translates into making the upper part of social stratification in this country, at the end of the day, it's all about how can I get good grades in this academic subject. And because of that reason, we have a situation of, wait a second, if you're going to educate young people on the theme of art, aren't you supposed to share the idea of what does it mean to appreciate art? How does that influence your life in a positive way? What does it mean to collectively appreciate art and generate a public discourse related to that? And therefore, hopefully hope that it will make a positive influence to other aspects of life. For example, democracy, for example, the economy, how to have a better critical view on the economy. For example, the environment, for example, urban landscaping, these kind of things. So I've reached the conclusion that learning art is one thing, acquiring it is another, and that education here in this country has somewhat failed to understand that it should be more focused on acquisition instead of just trying to inject some kind of set of knowledge on art and therefore make young students into walking Googles related to art. And that's why I have come, I'm sorry, let's see. There's one slide missing here actually, but yeah, I've come to the one explanation to try to explain what all this means. And I've coined the term subjectification. And what that means is because people consciously and unconsciously, that's young students that is, consciously and unconsciously take art in the context of pedagogy as not art itself, but an academic subject, you see the evolution of art into a subject, an academic subject. And after you're done with the whole college application and winning admissions project, you just get sick and tired of it. So you generate this kind of a phobia against art unless you have a really, really fundamental keen interest in it, which not even the social pressure of structuralized pedagogy can do about. And what happens is you try to distance yourself from it, and the exclusion of art happens in that particular fashion due to a phenomenon which I call subjectification. And then if you try to apply that to architecture in the context of pedagogy, what I find really interesting is that, and I don't know about countries in Europe, but here in South Korea is that there's a good thing about it and bad thing about it, because architecture is not any kind of academic subject in elementary school, middle school, or high school here in Korea. In other words, if you go to university and you want to be an architect, after your freshman year, you ask yourself, all right, so I'm affiliated to the College of Natural Sciences and Engineering, which specific discipline I want to choose. Let's see, maybe I should be an architect. And that's how pretty much things move on. So the good thing is, because there's no academic subject in previous years, you don't have to go through subjectification with respect to architecture. However, on the other side of the same coin, because there's no kind of academic practice related to architecture, directly related to architecture. In other words, there's no high school textbook which says architecture for 10th graders or that kind of a thing. You go through no kind of education, no kind of acquisition whatsoever. Therefore, the concept and practice of architecture doesn't become included into your everyday life. Therefore, in other words, it's completely structurally excluded. And I find that very, very interesting, because from an artistic viewpoint, at least, the way I view architecture is that it's the practice of art which is physically closest to us, right? We live in architectures, we make love in architectures, we do Zoom conferences in architectures. You can't have the whole hashtag, please stay at home during a global pandemic without architecture. So physically, it's the closest work of art. However, pedagogically and culturally, it's furthest, because nobody considers architecture art. It's just some kind of a work of engineering, or, oh, you know, I got to live at some home, right? And of course, make some money and then, I don't know, buy a house or pay rent for a house. That's just how things are in everyday life. Generally speaking, people, unlike people like ourselves, that is, of course, but for the general public, what happens is that architecture is just some kind of a thing which architects and urban planners develop, and we are just merely consumers who have to choose what kind of house we want to live in, what kind of city we want to live in, so on and so forth. So what I see here is a structural form of information asymmetry. And information asymmetry is a term used in economics to explain a situation where the demand and supply do not share the same level of information based on a certain good or service. For a very good example is the used goods market, right? The seller knows how horrible the item they're trying to sell is, but the buyer has no idea how horrible it is, right? So there's a clear asymmetry of information. And if you apply that logic to the situation of architecture, is that despite architecture, once again, being the physically closest form of art to us, however, culturally the furthest, means that the people who supply architecture and the people who demand architecture share a very, very serious imbalance in information regarding architecture and urban landscaping. Now, this picture right here is from a mining town in northern Sweden, or Norrland, by the name of Gällivare. I had the absolute pleasure of, and actually I would say pleasure / challenge of visiting here during my stay at UMA. And so we went on this expedition with a visual artist, a Korean visual artist by the name of Han Song-pil. He's of course the very Song-pil in our team in LS of Global and Local Imaginaries. So Song-pil and I, what we did was we visited a few really small rural or small rural towns, or these mining towns in northern Sweden. And this was one of our stops. And if you take a look at the architecture, these are, of course, the public housing plans for the miners who actually work in this town. And here's another picture right here. What you can tell from these pictures is that the architecture is extremely homogeneous. So from an architecture critic or urbanism critic's perspective, in other words, my perspective, what I see here is that if you're a young child and you are brought up in this kind of environment for say 10+ years, you go through a process where this living environment becomes a part of your identity. And without having some kind of a critical perspective on that, you will not realize how you're actually socially and anthropologically being labeled as someone who lives in this kind of an environment. So I think this is one of the many examples which hint to us as architects and architecture critics that we really have to focus on how do we develop, provide younger people with that kind of a critical eye on actually their own architecture, the own architectures they dwell themselves. And for this picture right here, this is actually a picture of the Hällnäs Sanatorium, of course, in Hällnäs, Sweden. And it used to be a sanatorium, of course, but they shut down the sanatorium in the mid-20th century, and then they reopened it to make it into a research center, and then they shut it again. And then what happened was, in the recent years, they are currently reusing this building as the living quarters for A, refugees, or B, berry pickers. And if you know anything about Sweden, you know how much the Swedes love their berries, right? But in all seriousness, we should also understand that the reason why when you go to a Swedish supermarket, for example, the Coop or ICA, the reason why the prices maintained at such a low level is because it's coming from very, very cheap it's come, I'm sorry, I just had to let someone in. It's come from very cheap labor. And when you have that kind of a situation and you're housing these people at a place which used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium way back in the day. And this is what the, this is what the sanatorium looks in the back, and you see a little playground here for the children, is that, again, these architectures, the very idea that some kind of a governmental branch came up with the idea that, okay, we will house these people in these architectures, including their young children, and provide these kind of toys in the playground, clearly shows that we have an issue of how the very idea of letting this happen is actually an issue of human rights infringement. And because throughout that process, there was a lack of that critical view, we have this kind of a situation happening. And again, what happens is throughout the process of socialization, it's that morphology and its semantics which develops that kind of a social identity, which I find extremely problematic. And finally, this is one of Song-pil's earlier works. The four previous works you just saw were from 2019. This was a few years back in downtown Seoul, as a matter of fact. And it's, for me, 2 years ago, I lived in Dublin, Ireland for 3 months. And the city center of Dublin is really, really interesting for a number of different reasons. But one thing is that I'm just giving you the example of Dublin because it's a European city, but it's that right in the dead center of the city, you see architectures which are rather similar to what you see right here in downtown Seoul. For example, Summerhill in Dublin, if you know where that place is. These really rough and old and poorly maintained modern works of architecture. And then because South Korea has a nearly 5 millennia long history, in the back, you see these Oriental buildings. And then in the far back, you see these really high and, welcome to the capitalist, the cutting edge capitalist future of Seoul architectures. And all this combined in the city center at walkable distances. And if you're, for example, a family living in those really old buildings, and as a matter of fact, quite a few of these buildings are already planned to be demolished and be transformed into the architectures you see in the far back. I would say that a very similar situation is happening right here in Seoul, similar to what I just said for the examples you see in rural Sweden. So, I thought about the concept of future school. And that's why amongst the several projects that I've been working on, I chose to go with this one for our team. And I've come up with the concept of architectural acquisition. And what this basically means is because we don't have any kind of curriculum at the below university level, especially here in Korea regarding architecture, despite the fact that architecture is so essential to the everyday lives of every single person, it's about time that we should focus on a curriculum design with not just injecting knowledge in, like who are the history of architecture, who are the great architects of the world, yada, 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 not that stuff, but to how to acquire the art and practice of architecture and urban landscaping, and to therefore develop that critical eye and have a more creative vision of what exactly it means to develop ideal architectures in terms of human rights and the environment. And again, if you infuse the idea that architecture, after all, is a form of fine art, to develop eventually a artistic and critical edifice so that we can hopefully in the future have better architectures through better future schools. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. And we would have the chance to come back to some of your propositions and ideas in the discussion. I would like just to give the floor to Mateusz. Oh, sorry, please, Mateusz, are you with us? Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so those are going to be 3 acts tough to follow because I'm up until just 10 seconds ago, I'm still revising my notes, what I'm going to say. So bear with me in case I'm being unclear or speak too fast or whatever. Please just raise a hand and let me know. I'll take no offense whatsoever. So let's see, I'll just share my screen. Go. Okay. So let's see. Up. That one. So, you know, after 18 months, you should be able to do this in your sleep, but no. There we go. So you guys see a map? Thumbs up. Excellent.
Yes.
So as opposed to the previous 3 presentations, because I'm an artist, my presentation is going to be a bit more egocentric. So I'm just focusing on one of my works and the reasons behind it. So the work I figured would suit the theme is, the working title is, what is this place? This is the place. And, you know, with all working titles that you come up with, after a while, they just stick. So right now, that's the name of the work. So the place, it's basically a mapping of a place in northeastern of Gothenburg. It's the clearing in a forest. It's a very picturesque area. It's been suggested to turn it into a natural park or a natural reserve. not sure of the difference there. So it's basically a small stream that's running through a very high valley. The mountains are shaped since are still rising from the last ice age. So it's very picturesque, and it's quite difficult to navigate outside of the trails. So the starting point for this work was mostly as a challenge to myself, because it's quite easy to do as an artist. I work mostly in photography and video right now. So as an artist, it's quite easy to show something the way you want to present it. But in this case, I want to show something the way based on the impression I got from the site. So how to show something the way I understand it, not only how I want to convince you, the audience, of how to see it. So basically, I've been coming back to this place on and off for a couple of years, but this last year I tried to be a bit more methodical about how to document it, or how to work with the site. So I've been trying out as many different perspectives of mapping as possible. So I've been trying to get into forensic photography, the way a police photographer might do it, or the way a cultural anthropologist might look at a site, or a biologist, or a runner who's just passing through, or whatever, looking at historical maps, that kind of stuff. So this is right now I have an ongoing site where I sort of try to document, well, all the different approaches. And the benefit of doing it this way is I could show it as a work in progress, because right now I don't see an end to this. It's basically I'll map this until I'm bored out of my skull, or so everyone else is. But for the benefit of this presentation, because I try to be quite a categorical person, I try to come up with what useful categories could I use to present this work to you, the audience. So I came up with 3 categories in no particular order. So the categories are the place as politics, and the place as aesthetics, and then the value of cargo culting. And I'll go through those each one. So sorry, let's jump back to the map. So the place as politics. It's actually interesting because Lärjedalen is located like northwest of Gothenburg, and is jammed between 3 areas that figure quite often in the media, because they're called in Swedish exposed areas, or utsatta områden, which means that there's a heavy police presence. You have like high profile crimes, gun violence, drugs. It's basically, endemic high unemployment, all other signifiers of low income segregated areas, right? So basically well, if you look at the red ring on the map, basically north of that you have Hjällbo and Eriksbo, and south of that you have Bergsjön. But because this area is really inaccessible, it becomes very much an untouched, like oasis, like in the forest, where people use it to travel from between areas, but it is difficult to navigate because it's very hilly and very steep. And especially if you compare it to the 60s, 70s, 80s aesthetics of really, similar homogeneous buildings surrounding it, it becomes very incongruous. The tracks in the area, you can see some like animal tracks, but some human tracks, and some garbage, some fireplaces, but it's really out of the way spot. So the contrast is really interesting. And right up to now, I haven't intended to map the areas outside of the site. But to the extent that, the surrounding areas with the, tens of thousands of people living there, to the extent that they affect what's happening in the site, I'm mapping that as well. But I'm not going outside of it, trying to find who, I'm looking inside out rather than trying to take the whole area in. The second part is the place as aesthetics, right? So the whole, occasionally, I'm sure everyone has had the experience. You come to a place which is ridiculously beautiful, right? So you're standing on a mountain, you're looking out, or you're by a lake, and you think like, this is just silly. I remember swimming in a coral reef sometimes, and I saw this turtle coming back, and I had to laugh because everything looked like a Disney movie. It becomes, so silly. So I have something similar. I had a similar experience the first time I passed through here. I think we were mushroom picking or something. but it's not the same like pretty beautiful experience, but it's much more solemn and serious impression, but it's quite big. Like imagine like my reference was, you know, the Caspar David Friedrich, The Wanderer, but imagine that the wandering isn't staying up on the mountains looking down, but rather at the foot of the mountain looking up, because you're basically standing and then you're standing in front of a bunch like mountains which are 10-15 meters tall, and they become your audience. It's very imposing scene. I don't know why. It's an aesthetic experience basically, which struck me quite well. It seemed very profound at the time first time I was there. And what's has me returning to the place is that it's so damn difficult to show this in art. This is why I'm trying to show this from as many perspectives as possible, perhaps by showing all of these different ways of looking at this, the site. Maybe we can map the whole experience of it. In the background, a friend of mine helped me out with some drone photography, and we did some photogrammetry based on this. And so this is just a quick 3D rendering based on his footage. And the benefit of trying to do this is also because it gives you different scale, right? So suddenly I can actually look down on the site. So I'm no longer 2 meters tall standing in the middle, but I'm actually, I can look down on it and get a different perspective, literally. So the aesthetics, even though the aesthetics might, like for me as a contemporary artist, the aesthetic part is the least interesting, I guess, because it is a very traditional romantic approach to something, right? It's both like 18th, 19th century romanticism and natural romanticism and all that. But I have to at least acknowledge that it's there, right? So it was for me a starting point, just the experience of the site. Let's see if I can speed up this and zoom up. Oh, we'll let this play in the background. So that's sort of the emotional starting point for why I chose this spot instead of any other. I mean, because if the political aspect of it had been more interesting or had been the point, then using this particular site isn't as important as any other site, right? But anyway, so the third aspect or category that I thought was interesting was, and most interesting from an artistic practice point of view, is the value of cargo culting. Cargo cult, I mean, old anthropological term where you pretend, where by using the tools and mannerism or rituals of someone else, you acquire the cargo or the benefit of whatever they're doing. But if you use it as a verb, cargo culting for me becomes rather that you try to simulate a behavior, or you take the tools or nomenclatures from someone else's profession and you apply them and you try to get something of value out of it. You're not going to arrive at the same end product by experimenting with forensic photography. I am pretending to be a forensic photographer, right? Which means that in some sense, I'm pretending to be like a cop on TV, and this is a crime scene, and I'm looking for clues. Suddenly, this place becomes a crime scene, and I try to solve something or find information there somewhere. I'm talking to the police because there's often a helicopter in the air because of these three areas. So I'm trying to get footage from the police. So how does it feel to be an operator looking down at the forest through a ER lens, looking for people or whatever? By using a metal detector, I can map the area. I can do some very recent archaeology of the site and try to map the human activity. By putting up cameras, like trail cameras, I can see what kind of animals and so on are passing through. So there are all these kind of perspectives or glasses that you can put on, and at the end of the day, what this gives you, I mean, the point for me, the way I think of it, the point for me as an artist isn't that my perspective or my view, whatever, is particularly important or clever or smart, but it gives me an excuse to try out all these different perspectives from and do my own amateurish attempt at drawing conclusions from them. So in the end, I can try out forensic photography, or I can try out forensic photography in a particular place, and then show the results, and ask people, so is this how you see the place? Does this make sense? Do you understand it the way I understand it when I'm showing you this? The video in the background here is just because the place looks a bit like from a fairy tale. I thought I was finding monsters under the rocks, so I just did a small animation. So I mean, the more ways you illustrate something, the more you open up for a discussion. I think as an artist, I mean, opening up for that discussion and coming to a conclusion about, how can we talk about this? That's sort of the interesting part, I guess, of this work. So maybe I could, as an artist, I can be useful in that discussion, and also I need to entertain myself. So the best of two worlds, basically, in this project. Yeah, so that was my rambling presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. So, right, so it would be very interesting to continue our conversations. We are having our last presentation, which is CJ and me, and we decided to somehow kind of divide it in between us, as we always do with our work, but to read as much as we can, because to keep time so we don't run over time. So first I should just mention, do you start sharing, Carl-Johan, CJ? First, I should just mention that for us, it's been extremely important to kind of connect the topic of global and local to a series of projects and practices, and try to see how we can start seeing relationships between both projects we have carried out in our own practice, but also in teaching, in collaborations. And we try to show some glimpses of some of these projects through our presentation. So, Green Imaginaries, exploring the relationship between nature and culture. The history of Western urban planning and design exhibits a clear dichotomy between nature and culture. This is something that has underpinned our work very much. This dichotomy, causing an evident conflict between urban development and protection of nature, is still prevalently dominant in contemporary urban planning and design. The aim of our presentation, our work, practice, and research is to challenge this opposition by exploring alternative ways of seeing, understanding, and working with the relationship between nature and culture, around looking and exploring other fields of knowledge, such as, for instance, political ecology, eco-criticism, ecosophy. Central in the contemporary debate of urban political ecology and environmental aesthetics is a questioning of the hegemonic notion of nature and the relationship between nature and culture. To be able to confront the current world order and imagine radical socio-ecological change, an ecological view beyond the conventional understanding of sustainability is needed. In here we can discuss and expand more about it, but it feels important just to contextualize our position. Further, ecological theorist Timothy Morton argues that what stands in the way of a truly sustainable environmental thinking is the image of nature itself. There is a need for an understanding of ecology without nature, from which the social construct of the image of nature as the opposite to culture has to be removed. Here, the thinking of Gregory Bateson and Felix Guattari, expanding the notion of ecology through a broader set of conditions and relationships, is helpful, including social relationships, human subjectivity. This notion of ecology could be a way of thinking a model for understanding the world, as well as a medium to imagine and project other ways of living and coexisting. Spatial investigations of the relationship between nature and culture. So we will look at some case study just to kind of pinpoint more specifically in some examples. In this presentation, we want to just very briefly touch on a trajectory of spatial investigations into this relationship, exploring ways to catalyze change within global transformation through working in local conditions, looking at investigations that very much try to expand notions of methodology and how we work, how we can intertwine working in practice in academia, how we can see it as a possibility to have an intertwined relationship between the two. The focus of the work has been on themes that are particularly relevant for us and that are affecting us in our daily life, but also that we see are global concerns that have local implications, such as climate change, finite resources, emerging technologies, socio-ecological urban and rural development, and ethics, and how professional ethics and ethical design. In the case of Barcelona, we explore together with students, but also in our own practice, how we could develop future scenarios for alternative relationship between the flows of energy and matter produced by the city's official identity and a real existing social, cultural, and ecological system. Here meaning the city of Barcelona is one of the cities in the world that has an enormous industry of producing itself as a brand. But on the other hand, we have the Barcelona very strong neighborhood community initiatives and alternative initiatives. And we thought it was an interesting to how to intervene within these spaces. We approach the fabric of an urban neighborhood in Barcelona, Poblenou, looking at it as test bed for testing the idea of a circular metabolic landscape and see how these processes could be led into enclaves or ideas of a neighborhood being self-sustainable. So we looked at Poblenou as a known system of flows of energy and matter and possibilities of reuse, recycling, rethinking life cycles of products and materials otherwise considered as waste, making it possible for the neighborhood to take care of its own output within its border, but also imagining itself as a self-sufficient enclave in the city of Barcelona itself, which also could further project also notions of self-governance and other possibilities within this self-sufficient neighborhood. Collected waste from the district is proposed to be processed and reused in the construction of a growing park landscape, giving the amount of garbage from the city a physical body. And just to match the images that we're showing, I should just mention that Barcelona is one of the cities that we've been working for 15, 20 years, and where there is very strong social movements, both in terms of participation, also reactions and protests against gentrification. So the notion of also looking at very hands-on alternatives to how to process some of these flows was also an idea how to empower, but how to give other possibilities to the alternative possibilities to the very strong dominant rhetorics about urban plans and projects in Barcelona. In our explorations, we also look at an extension towards the sea and critically engage in how the coastline is today an artificial shoreline, part of the projection of a certain imagery of the city towards attracting tourists, but actually in itself, it doesn't really exist due to the erosion and heavily buildings that have been built along the coastline. So we looked at how excess water from the city's stormwater retention tanks could create the conditions for water cleansing wetlands of fresh, brackish salt water with a wide spectrum of flora and fauna, and how that could in itself start creating a new type of semi-urban biotopes, which also could create own alternative ecosystems to the coastline. So by exposing this invisible waste landscape, a landscape of waste, the park becomes a tool for understanding the cycles of waste production, as well as by looking at the coastline, we aimed to try to set the ground for a more local circular economy. In the example of Gothenburg, another city that we've also been working, and that is also a harbor city, we were more interested in how to take this further to look at a larger scale of urban networks of productive ecologies. So zooming out from rather working with a neighborhood, we started looking at the city itself that has been undergoing major changes in the past decades, and how we could also address some of the challenges that the city has been facing and is facing in the future, such as floodings, and how this risk and threats to the city could be exposed, but also integrated into future scenarios in our imagined futures for the city of Gothenburg. So we studied the water edge ecologies, the logics and dynamic of ecosystems, and how they are dependent or profiting from flooding and fluctuating water levels, imagining the riverbanks as a potential productive edge and a water infrastructure system. So in opposition to the harbor itself, we zoom out to see the whole ecosystem of the river, not only the, if you would see in the image, the harbor, it's located more towards the mouth of the river, at the delta of the river. And we, departing from the understanding of this coastal edge as a system, both a productive industrial edge, but also an operative infrastructure, we developed propositions for this urban network, a series of interconnected cross-program spaces and interventions where flooding could be seen as a resource for the future of Gothenburg. So instead of protecting the city from the flooding, to rather change the notion and the imagination of the city to actually live with water instead of protect itself from the water, which seems to be pretty difficult and useless in current models and explorations about flooding and how to deal with flooding in urban context. So I give the word to you, CJ, to continue.
Yes, thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the last example, the work in the north of Sweden, in Norrland, where we looked at rural networks of commons. Our work here has been focusing on exploring an alternative relationship between the urbanization of the north of Sweden and the rural landscape that it leaves behind. A land that is still needed to feed the growth with resources and energy. We have approached Norrland as a territorial product of historical and contemporary geopolitical, socio-cultural, economic, climatic, environmental conditions and processes, and the relationship between rural and urban, and the effects that the process of urban centralization has on its surrounding landscape. Through a critical mapping of current cultural, industrial, social, agriculture conflicts, struggles, and initiatives, we have found that the formation of new commons, resources, and spaces held in common is emerging in the region. Rethinking issues of production, consumption, distribution, land use, and resources. We have departing from an understanding of ecology through a broader set of conditions and relationships. Try to apply and explore notions of commons and social cultural networks as key strategies in this endeavor. Imagining a growing network of interlinked local initiatives, we believe could lead to an alternative future for the region as an emerging territory of socio-ecological change. So, to sum up, our methodology using different ways of mapping, analyzing, and understanding responses and tactics to the global crisis in a local context in order to construct alternative scenarios and other models of development. How do we imagine alternative futures and develop spatial practices for social, ecological, urban, and rural development beyond the ideas of an endless growth? Common for the examples that we have described is an expanded idea about ecology to include social relations and human subjectivity as a way of thinking, understanding the world, as well as the medium to imagine and project other ways of living and coexisting. Here, a territory, landscape, city, or neighborhood could be imagined to function as an ecosystem of overlapping and productive socio-ecological networks. The idea of networks is developed as a flexible series of interconnected self-sufficient spaces, a framework based on an understanding of sociological relationships between territories on multiple scales. We see an urgent necessity for a broad understanding of the complex political, economic, social, and environmental forces that influence urban and rural development and transformation today, as well as an urgent need for holistic, interdisciplinary, and experimental approaches to address these challenges and explore alternative models. In their article, Radical Urban Political Ecological Imaginaries, Planetary Urbanization and Politicizing Nature, Maria Kaika and Erik Swinidow ask for a radical shift in how we understand the current situation and how we could imagine a different future. There is an urgent task ahead to delve into the complex linkages between discourse, post-political management, and environmental socio-ecological inequalities. It is necessary to ask questions about what visions of nature and what socio-environmental relations are being promoted, what quilting points are being used and how are they being stitched together, and who are promoting these visions and why, what issues and whose voices are being silenced in the process, and how are these discourses competing with, altering, or being altered by other alternative discourses. So what we ask is, what kind of futures does the contemporary practice of urban design allow for? And is it possible to imagine other futures departing from alternative relationships between nature and culture? What kind of life do we imagine, and for whom?
Thank you very much. And I think we have 2 questions already that I would try to pose. We are running over time. Our presentations took longer. Sorry about that. But I hope is everybody okay to carry on, or would you need a few minutes break? Is everybody okay to carry on? Yeah. Okay, so Ji-Jun, would you like to go ahead? You had a question?
Yes. Hi, everyone again. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question for David and Joe. For David, I wanted to ask for Toluca, the transportation system, who would this mostly benefit? I've been to Mexico City a couple of times, and something that I was very impressed about the metro system is that it was used by a variety of class and people with different backgrounds, and I thought that was very like the heart of the city. And something else that was at the time happening was the issue of the airport, whether it should be built or not. And was it for the people or was it for the travelers, the visitors? And it was very interesting that the people kind of voted no to this massive airport being built. I think it was supposed to be built by David Chipperfield. So, and then another thing that was interesting for me was the people disagreeing to build transportation to Oaxaca. I think it was the train system because of the environment. So my understanding is that people in Mexico City generally have a very close relationship with nature and the neighborhood and the people that live in it. So I was wondering if the transportation to Toluca and Mexico City, like how could this benefit the people living in it, living surrounding it, and such. So it's just like a general question. And then for Teu, I thought it was very interesting that you pointed out the art education system being much of a problem here in architecture in general. My question to you is, how do we reclaim these existing spaces in architecture, right? Because you pointed out that these apartments are all homogeneous in Sweden also, and I also live in the part of Seoul that it's all just apartments, and this is where I grew up my whole entire life. And I don't know how I could, reclaim these spaces without even thinking about like demolishing. But I've seen in the historical like records that demolishing also isn't the best idea, right? There was like an attempt by this Korean government one time to demolish the Japanese government building to erase colonial history. And to me, that wasn't so successful because it was, demolished before I was born. So my generation didn't really get to experience the colonial architecture almost because it's kind of all been erased from history. So then how do we reclaim these like painful histories, these spaces that are, associated with like bad power and authority, without, hurting the environment and without being a waste? So that's my two questions.
Brilliant question. Thank you very much, June.
Thank you. May I go? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. I think it's very interesting because it touches very important parts of both sort of like the system in which we're embedded politically and economically, but also it touches upon the, as you mentioned, cultural issues, right? With how we relate to our own territory. I'm very excited to see all these talks because it allowed me also to figure out this common ground that we were also trying to focus on, that had to do with mapping, that had to do with identity, that had to do with like what Jewo was mentioning about this differentiation or like alienation of the architecture as a practice of the bourgeois or the capitalists. And I think this particular issue, what you touch on transport, has to do a lot with that. Because in Mexico, in general, in all the cities in Mexico, in the urban areas, mobility is 70% of the mobility happens with no private cars. However, in average, 80% of the public budget goes to roads. That's very uneven because, and of course, roads also means like transportation of goods and all that. But it's really interesting because somehow there is a vision that is some sort of like inherited by the 20th century capitalism, neoliberalism, and also modern movement all put together. Colonialism, of course, is part of the history and it's prevailing somehow. And what I think is that it's not only about who benefits from it, which of course will be mostly working class going back and forth, but in terms of what we're trying to do with the academic world is give tools to students and to practitioners on how we become conscious of all these issues that are probably not really architectural, for example, the budgets in public policy and so on, but they are very much architectural at the same time. And I think that's what my interest comes. How do we build up a practice that is more aware of things that are probably parallel or multidisciplinary together with architecture, such as art, as we saw here in the discussion and so on, but that it really brings us to a point of questioning our own practice, right? So I think that's what's really interesting in terms of like the practice in itself. Probably not saying that we like radically become activists. That would be very open to anyone to decide on that. But really, like, how do I position myself towards these issues? No, in terms, for example, with the airport that you mentioned, it's been canceled. Nowadays, there's other projects, but somehow there's not really a clear vision on why they want to do this or that in the long term. And I think that's what's the more questionable, because architecture at some point, for example, in terms like Norman Foster, the architect who had the project and so on, they easily detach from that. You know, like, I had the project, now I don't have it, nothing happens. And I think something happens. I think we're all involved in those, in many ways, in responsibilities, but architecture has had this sort of like, I don't know, privilege of like putting a distance somehow. And I don't think that's fair anymore. I think that we're really obliged to position ourselves and become more aware on how we tackle those issues. That would be my opinion, my point of view.
Thank you, David. Maybe we can let Cheu answer, and then if you have any other questions, June or anybody else, please do contact me on the chat and I follow up.
Okay, so I first want to say thank you very much for asking such a not only insightful question, but also extremely practical one. Because if you think about it, let's just imagine that we're conducting this roundtable in 100% Korean, and we have, say, like 5,000, 10,000 Koreans having a listen to us live. And they hear someone like myself saying that, and therefore, because of the homogeneousness issue and how it develops a homogeneous social identity, we have to just completely demolish all these apartment complexes in Seoul. And people will think that I'm just absolutely insane, because they'll say, do you not watch the news? Seoul has a rather serious housing issue. It's not just Dublin, it's not just London, it's also us. Which I also find kind of interesting, because if you're an OECD country, aren't you supposed to have enough houses for all its residents in the first place anyway? So that's another interesting irony there. So where I'm getting at is you're absolutely right. I have no interest whatsoever in all of a sudden just wrecking down all these, apartment complexes. But I will say this: if we can go back to the image, the work of Han Sung-pil that I shared with you guys earlier. Let's see if I can find it. All right, there we go. So I'm just going to briefly do a share screen once again. And yes, so this is what downtown Seoul looks like currently. And if we do a comparison and contrast between the older modern style architectures you see in the front and the really high-end state-of-the-art ones you see in the back, and you see a lot of them are actually under construction as well in this picture. It's interesting because those architectures you see in the back, which will become the future homes of many people in this city, also somewhat have some kind of a morphological homogeneousness to them. In other words, 50, 100 years later, people like myself will pretty much be saying the exact same thing what I said today, that again, this homogeneous, it proves that you belong to that certain social class who can afford that kind of living quarters, right? So where I'm getting at is, if this is going to be a continuous pattern, what we should have is not just people like myself, but a more general public and a more general understanding, a more public discourse, a more public edifice. Because an edifice is not, I'm sorry, not edifice, episteme, that's the right word, an episteme, which means it's a universal sharing of a demographic of a certain time period. For example, this identical generation, right? I would like to suggest that perhaps the generation of someone like Greta Thunberg, her contemporaries, and even the generations younger than her, deserve some kind of a style of pedagogics that enable them to develop that kind of a critical viewpoint, that something is very wrong here. And therefore, if some of us want to become architects of the future, urban engineers of the future, we should really not emulate these former models. That's where I'm getting at. And as for then, what do we do now in the contemporary? Are we just doomed? No, 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 no. We can do some different things. First off, at least have a public discussion on this matter, and therefore try alternative ways to understand that let's not let these architectures, the morphologies and their semantics get into our minds in a governing fashion. That's what I would suggest, number one. Number two is from the top of my head, and because I'm a curator as well, apply, say, a neo-Banksy kind of not just some kind of a provocative street art fashion, but some other ways to properly, for example, have people who live in these buildings express themselves in a non-homogeneous way. And obviously, I'm going to have to work a little bit more on that because what I just said is just way too vague. But will it be possible for us to come up with a feasible idea where we can exercise that in a joyful and deconstructive fashion regarding the current issues of contemporary architecture, especially here in South Korea? That would be my very rough and immediate response to your rather wonderful question. And I hope it gave you some help.
Thank you very much
You're
for your answers, David and Theo. I would like just to point perhaps to that your question also has the answer when you said reclaiming the spaces. So perhaps it's about the reclaiming of the spaces. I would like to, do you have any other questions, other comments you want to follow up?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I would like to follow with some questions to our other speakers. And please do, if you have questions, just put it in the chat and I follow up. I have a question for you, Killian, and as well, Mateusz, and that is related to somehow something that is apart between the work of you both, but I would like to raise the discussion on those matters. In terms of you, Killian, I think it's amazingly interesting to see the relationships of these very local phenomenon, conditions, expressions, and how they are really part of a much bigger picture, both the global extraction of resources and colonialism, but how they are expressed, like say in the student projects in the very spaces of in Scotland. And I was thinking, developing these critical pedagogies, your critical practice in your research, it seems that representation, the use of images, whether it's in film or mapping, or you also mentioned with the Batwa people that the models were really crucial. We would like to just hear your reflections on the tools and how you try to sort of implement that, because it requires another way of drawing, another way of explaining, another way of visualizing, especially in terms of the work you have been carrying out in Rwanda, which is more of an oral culture, and so in your film Uppland, which is more based on the oral history, the interviews, and so forth. So it's interesting, and it's not part of the conventional history. So it would be interesting to hear you more on that, which relates to you, Mateusz, in terms of developing different instruments and ways of perspective and exploring, which I think is extremely interesting, but I can come back to you and Mateusz as well in a moment. So if you go ahead first, Killian.
Gulp, I will do my best. So let me just say that the kind of work that I do has kind of shifted, let's say, into film or working with maps, is a way, on one hand, in a kind of reaction to the let's say the kind of paradigm of humanitarian architecture, or which is really kind of couched in this critical regionalist sort of idea of specificity and site. Okay, and it's really, I mean, it's valued for sure, but it's somewhat really apolitical and ahistorical in terms of reducing the kind of scale of the kind of problem, okay, or the challenge, so to speak. So, like, let's say for example, when I go to Rwanda and I build in bricks, you know, it is a local and established practice, but it has come from elsewhere when you begin to kind of research the brick. Okay, so the reason that I'm kind of like working with these other methods such as film and mapping are sort of to do with trying to both bridge the kind of issues of the kind of trans-historical, you know, this is a kind of a historical thing that keeps happening or reproducing itself, like this colonialism or this inequality or this dispossession of people from land, and then how it's sort of implicated at this kind of, you know, at this global scale. And so that's kind of why I'm working with film. I mean, through Edward, the director that I work with, I mean, film can kind of transcend space in a kind of second. We can shift between Sweden and Liberia. We can combine Sweden and Liberia in the same frame, and that's a kind of really powerful tool, film. And the same with kind of maps. And so maps, I mean, essentially are in Africa have been the kind of drawing tool to eradicate people from maps and to kind of conquest it. And when I say people, I mean, let's say, in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, but in the context of Ireland too, you know, particularly in the remapping of Ireland and the renaming of place names, yeah, and the omission from the land-based poor. So, so maps are really kind of an important tool, and those who use mapping, of course, understanding the importance of counter mapping. But so sort of maps in themselves can become prohibitive or limiting in that they're static and they're always kind of like top down or who makes them. And so I'm interested in, and you know, some of Mateusz's work resonated with me. A lot of it did, in fact, the sort of the multi-perspectival nature of a map, or the many different ways that a space can be interpreted or understood. And for like communities like the Batwa, they're not anthropologists, you know, as much as they bring information to us or understand these places that are foreign to us, they have a tendency to categorize societies as oral-based societies and text-based societies. Those who write and those who speak. We are text-based societies. We produce papers. We record our knowledge, be it in buildings or in text or in maps. They're kind of static things. Oral-based communities don't necessarily record their understandings of a place by writing it. You know, they kind of speak it out or they perform it. So kind of, on one hand, I'm interested in the way kind of drawings and maps kind of simplify space, but then kind of bringing their understandings to it to kind of lift or apprehend our understandings of place. And apprehending on our understanding of a place, I think, is what Mateusz is doing with his maps. He's kind of going, okay, yes, it is kind of seen from above, but like once you scan it, you see it here, or you engage with it a different way. So maps, and it's really kind of like questions of scale and complexity, which is why I've kind of moved away from the building. But how to return to the building is much more of a difficult journey back.
Great, thank you. I could go for hours with this discussion because I think it also affects all of us in this group, but also in trying to do the type of work we are doing, kind of looking at alternatives and ways of understanding architecture from other perspectives. Mateusz, I think Killian gave you a really good kind of linkage to your work in terms of multi-perspectival and how you're trying to sort of map. And I was just had a very tiny association, because there's a group of people around the world working with these new technologies like drone and like using this notion of forensic photography, but also, you know, how you can read the IR and so and using other technologies to actually look at the impact in the environment. So that would be like your fourth point, perhaps, possibly, you know, what's the impact of the police, the kind of politics of the place, but also the environmental issues. That would be interesting. And I, you know, to see that could be a very interesting avenue as well. But I'm also here more curious about the carboculting and how you see the carboculting as, because I think you're introducing an amazingly interesting kind of concept.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for the volley or layup or whatever the term is, Killian. I mean, the how you go from a particular mapping back to a house, right? If I see that as a metaphor, the easy part, right? If we just use the tools of a particular trade or a profession to do one mapping, then we're basically amateur archaeologists, forensic photographers, architects, whatever, you know, we're amateurs within that field. But if we as artists put on 2 or 3 or 4 different lenses or hats or professions, then suddenly you get this mix of views and something new gels out of it. But the difficulty will be, like, if you want to do something, you know, prescriptive or actually reach a conclusion, then you need to draw a conclusion from it, right? So how do you come back to a house from doing this mashup of doing biological research or you know, climate change due to gentrification process in nearby areas or whatever? It's really difficult. And so for me, it's at this stage in this project, it's easier to just focus on one technique at a time, because that allows me to just be an amateur within that field. As soon as I started combining a bunch of different techniques, which I will have to do once this, you know, project has like 20 different perspectives, then I'm going to have to do a synthesis of all this and come to some sort of conclusion of some sort. And that's a bit scary, because that's the point where once you start interpreting the data and you layer different kinds of data on top of each other and methodologies, then suddenly you become very alone with your synthesis, right? And you need to explain why this makes sense. Up until then, you just had to do the mapping, and on each particular mapping, you're following best practice or you want to reach a particular result. But once you started combining that stuff, it becomes really messy. And I think that the danger for me or my practice, it's not dangerous. The one consequence of the way I practice would be that I become too infatuated with the technology, right? So because I am a huge nerd and geek, but from the beginning, I have this. I find things awfully fascinating. So because I wasn't aware of for example, a couple of years ago, I started up an organization which was going to build a biohacking lab in Gothenburg. So I got very much into biology. I was looking to learn synthetic biology. I was reading books and so on, went to conferences. So, you know, the whole idea of 1 teaspoon of dirt contains a multitude, more bacteria and more species than whatever, you know, there are millions and millions of living things in each cube centimeter of stuff. Once you as an amateur learn this, it becomes just so fascinating in itself. But if you talk to biologists, they go like, yeah, so we know, what's the conclusion? But you as an amateur, or I as an amateur, just think this is so fascinating and go like, yeah, I'm going to draw every bacteria. I'm going to do conceptual artwork. You know, and it just, you get so focused on that tool and what that perspective offers you, that just the consequences are just unrealistic. Or in Swedish it's called dra stora växlar på något, when you build a hill out of a molehill, all right, or something like that in English.
Well, you could also see it as that liberates you, that it means that you can make new associations and new connections.
Of course. I mean, if you're lucky, then you come up with something interesting. You draw a new conceptual conclusion from this, or from a combination of two different points of view, right? So do an infrared scan of foliage and soil bacteria and compare those two with weather pattern changes due to climate change, and suddenly you can present it as an artistic work. But for me, as a geek, it's easy to get stuck on these, just the tools, right? So first we invent the tools and we use them, but then the tools shape us, and it's a constant, again, not a danger, but a constant risk that you're running, that you adapt the language of the tools and the trade that you're using. So the cargo culting, I mean, originally cargo culting it's not in vogue anymore to talk about it. It seems as a disparaging term. But if you see cargo cult as you're basically imitating a trade or a pattern or ritual in hopes of getting a result, any result, but something good, right? You want the cargo. You're acting in a certain way to get the cargo, and the cargo in my case would be knowledge, maybe, or if I do forensic photography, it's a clue. But it's like related to the fake it till you make it thing, right? You're pretending to be something, but that you're not, but you're actually doing your best. It's not that you're faking for an audience. You're actually trying your best to being a forensic photographer. It's just that you might not be a very good one. I don't have 5 years of training as a forensic photographer, but I can try the tools and it might tell me something new, and maybe combined with other stuff, maybe it's interesting in an art context, right? But yeah, but I thought it was, I mean, the question, how do you get back to a house, or how do you get back to actually drawing a conclusion that is useful? I mean, that's the end result, right? If you do a show, if you do an exhibition, if you can't present a compelling argument for that what you're doing is interesting, then you've kind of failed. You might have entertained yourself, but you might have failed as an artist in that instance.
I have to cut in. We have some members of the panel that have to leave, unfortunately, but we run out over time. But I'm very interested in also some of the questions that were raised, to see if we can sort of conclude so perhaps we can say thank you to those that need to leave. I believe Killian, thank you very much. It's been great having you on board, and perhaps we meet soon again. So thank you for your participation and your contributions, and this is part of an ongoing conversation. So just would like to connect to some of the points made that I thought were really important. I think our audience, thank you. Just to wrap up, some of the points that were made, I think, are worthwhile to continue. And I think also to connect to the presentation, to you, CJ, into our presentation, but also to the question Jion was asking, which are to do with actually how do we do it? In a way, I didn't say you were saying it, but I read between the lines is how do we do it? I mean, David, you were pointing out about an awareness and how through teaching to expand and become aware within practice, and Jion, you were our audience questions which were really sharp, raising like for whom, who is accessing it, but what do we do of these areas? And I think, Cheo, you were trying to raise the point about how do we actually rethink a curriculum, but how do we think around what the impact of these places and the way we look upon our environment has. And in a way, you are suggesting also a practice of changing the way we teach or the way we think around it. But still we are, having this housing stock, these buildings, and how I was just pointing that I thought Tion's question was in itself answering the notion of reclaiming the spaces. And then Mateusz, you're talking about, when it comes to actually drawing a conclusion or beyond the mapping, it becomes the tricky point, or is the challenge, or how do you not become too narrow-minded in that? And CJ, you and me are trying to sort of present in a way, in a very quick way, but ways we are trying which perhaps on one level are more programmatic. On another level, we're trying to say, okay, is that the step between proposing strategic and programmatic levels to be able to pinpoint more in the architecture? So I just would like to end up opening the floor to everybody in terms of more, how do we go about it? We don't have the answers. Perhaps we don't have the time either to do long-winded suggestions, but just a quick word from each of you. And perhaps you can start, CJ, that haven't really answered any questions, and then we go about everybody that has been part of the discussion.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I think, I mean, what also unites us in the work in the atlas of local and global imaginaries, I think it's the notion of imaginary, what it is that we can imagine. And I think all the work that we are trying to do is finding ways to imagine other types of possible futures in a way. And then we are looking at very different tools and ways of working in order to find that, to get beyond the kind of the limitations and the kind of obvious ways of doing things. And so I think it also kind of gives us, in Mateusz's case, I think it's so nice to see that it doesn't have to be one answer to your one synthesis, but rather that you make new connections between unexpected things, which can open up for other ways of interpreting things in multiple ways. So it's not only for us to make the synthesis or conclusion. I think in our work, it's more about pointing out certain possibilities that are not obvious in the first place, and see where those can take a development further. I mean, that's the whole notion of why we look at the idea of nature, because that is something that really limits our thinking, and how we can imagine urbanism, and how that is kind of the opposite of nature. But I think there is beyond another understanding that we see that rather, if we start to look at how things really work, and how then we see similarities between things that can be interlinked in another way than just seeing that they are opposites.
Great, thank you. The rest of you, please go ahead. Just
yeah, I'm just going to tie in. I thought that was a good summation, Korean, because I was thinking of Jewu's notion about the education system, right? So the goal isn't necessarily to arrive at one solution or one answer which is dogmatic, but rather what kind of approaches lead to a multitude of voices, which might in the end give us one or a couple of results which are beneficial to the people participating, and have as many people as possible participate, right? So it's more like, Carl-Johan, what you were saying, it's not so much that we find one approach that is the best or that we dogmatically follow, but rather, you know, how can we humbly propose different approaches to even have the discussion? What are the conditions for developing different futures, right? So, and I think that's seeing as a common denominator. I think that was a good point.
thank you. Anybody else that wants to have an concluding comment?
For me, I think this has been a very interesting and very revealing discussion, because what I found, it's kind of like a little conclusion probably, but what I found is that in this contemporary practice, or this contemporary agenda that we have developed as architects, we have a very interesting activity that is visualization, and that means unveiling things, unveiling issues, problems that are not necessarily that are not evident. I think that's what's really interesting. Through all these tools, the ones that Mateusz develops, or Jewu, or any other that are different but also very common in a way, I think that's what's really interesting, is what I say, like architecture becomes an activity of visualization, and that also has to do with pinpointing things that are in crisis, that probably because of the system are not seen commonly, or probably we don't want to see because it's more convenient to not to be seen. But if we grow up these tools, I think then we can achieve other means of solving these issues that have to do, of course, with space, but with many other topics. That would be my very interesting conclusion for myself even. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mateusz?
Yeah, yes. Let's see. I'll try to exercise a wrap up and kind of a suggestion, a general suggestion to everyone who's participated in today's roundtable in kind of a comprehensive fashion. But first off, what I found really interesting about David's presentation and his project is that it's not just about constructing a network of rail in between cities and locations and therefore to connect people. What I found really interesting is that how do we utilize this in the best possible fashion? And by doing so, throughout a platform such as the Biennale, how can we share that idea and make it into a more universal idea so that other regions in the world can apply that idea of not just connecting us, but utilizing that connection in the most ideal fashion, make all that matter. And I'm saying this because I've been thinking about the whole concept of social/physical distancing throughout the past 2 years of the pandemic. And what I've realized is that while the pandemic itself is new, there is absolutely nothing new about social and physical distancing. I would even say that there has been a rather prominent form of social distancing architecture as well, as you've seen in the pictures of Norland presented in Anna and CJ's works, or the pictures of Barcelona and the pictures of Seoul and other areas. And I think all societies in the modern world have that kind of an issue. So how do we solve that situation? Well, one approach that we can take is something that we learned from Mateusz today, is that, because what I find interesting about Mateusz's approach is that once you have a specific kind of technology and you're only allowing a so-called group of professionals to have full access to it, that itself, what you're doing is you're giving them an exclusive right and therefore an exclusive power to utilize that technology. However, if you have artists like Mateusz, these geeks, and you give them the freedom and the artistic creativity to figure out different ways to utilize it and proliferate that idea so that other people can share that practice, you have a more general understanding and a more democratic style of development of finding new possibilities for these new technologies. And so that comes back to my project as well, which is pretty much that before trying to find and spread the answer, let's first find and spread the right questions. That's what my suggestion would be. And to actually publish an atlas of global and local imaginaries. And of course, imaginaries do not start with answers. They start with questions. If we can possibly do that, if today's talk can be some kind of a starting point for that, I would be very, very happy as a participant of this collective.
Great, thank you very much, Yu. June, would you like to say something more, or you are no?
I think that was a good conclusion to the, I agree with everyone's goals. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I would like to extend a very big thank you to the Future School, and especially to the curator Hai-Won Shin, who is the director of the program of the Future School for the Korean Pavilion, who has very generously allowed us to be part of this program. And I also would like to thank you, June, that is also part of the Future School office, for your interventions, insightful questions, and for taking part. And for the rest that have been taking part, thank you very much. And for the team, I look forward to continue our conversations. So this is, like you said, too, a starting point. Thank you, everybody, for today. Thank you. And we will post the recording. We will, in our part of the website for in the Venice Biennale Future School link. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
감사합니다. 탁수미캣.
감사합니다.
Thank you.
Oh,
Hi,
Oh,
everyone.
hello.
Amazing.
Who's that?
Hey.
hey, thank you, Haiwon. Lovely to see you.
I know. It's 10:30. It's amazing. It's like intense discussion, although it's quite late in the evening here. It's I look forward to the next two rounds.
Yes.
Although it seems like you could go on for for another 10.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Haiwon. It's so
Thank
lovely
you.
to see you. And thank you for the
And
opportunity.
you've been live in the Korean Pavilion. I think there's still, the audience can see us having
Yes.
this last discussion.
Great. We will
So-
post the images in the webpage. Thank you, Haiwon. And
Great. Thank you.
everybody. Thank you.
And thank you, Chiyun.
Bye.
Hi,
Thank you.
Jaewoo.
Bye all.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.